In 1939, as the lights went out across Europe once again, chaos reigned. Nazi Germany's armies swept across the continent, leaving Britain standing alone after the fall of France. Desperately trying to find a way to strike back at Germany, the RAF Bomber Command launched its early daytime raids over German territory. Missions filled with hope, courage, and confidence, but ending in catastrophic losses. The British bombers attempted to fly in broad daylight across enemy skies, only to be torn apart by waves of German fighters and perfectly coordinated flak defenses. Engines bursting into flames, cockpits shattered by bullets, formations collapsing into chaos, and the terrifying realization that almost half the bombers were not coming home. In Britain, newspaper headlines reported entire squadrons lost, families receiving telegrams, and military commanders realizing that their daylight strategy was unsustainable. Air Force leaders quickly concluded that daylight bombing was too costly and too deadly. Germany's air defenses were too strong, and the bombers Britain had were too slow, too lightly armed, and not accurate enough to survive. Therefore, Britain shifted toward nighttime operations, not because it offered better accuracy, but because darkness offered the only protection. Meanwhile, the Americans had not yet entered the war, but American air doctrine had been forming throughout the 1930s at the Air Corps Tactical School. American theorists believed heavy bombers such as the B-17 Flying Fortress could defend themselves through overlapping fields of machine gun fire. American test flights where groups of B-17s flew in tight combat box formations, their gunners practicing coordinated defense, believing no enemy fighter could break through. The Americans claimed a well-armed bomber formation does not need escorts. This belief became the cornerstone of American air doctrine. The Americans also believed strongly in daylight precision bombing. They developed advanced technology like the Norden bombsight, which they claimed could hit a target the size of a pickle barrel from high altitude. Accuracy was the heart of their strategy, and accuracy required daylight. To the Americans, the idea of bombing at night seemed reckless and wasteful. They thought night bombing was little more than guessing. When the Americans finally arrived in Britain in 1942, the tension was palpable. British commanders tried to warn them, if you fly in daylight, your losses will be unbearable. But the Americans refused to abandon their doctrine. They believed their bombers were tougher, better armed, and supported by superior technology and training. American crews arrived at their new air bases in the British countryside, confident and full of morale. British officers watching skeptically, remembering the horrors of 1940. The Americans prepared for their first missions with optimism. The British shook their heads, knowing what daylight over Germany really meant. The philosophical divide was profound. Britain flew by night because experience had shown daylight to be a death sentence. America insisted on flying by day because their entire doctrine depended on accuracy and firepower. The stage was set for one of the greatest strategic debates of the war. One side shaped by painful lessons, the other driven by unproven but confident theory.
Create a tense, cinematic narration describing how the United States 8th Air Force arrived in Britain and began preparing for massive daylight bombing raids over Europe. Start with a sweeping view of newly built American airfields across the English countryside, long runways carved through fog-covered farmlands, rows of gleaming B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators standing ready, and young American crews filled with energy, confidence, and the belief that their strategy would change the course of the war. Describe their early missions over occupied France, where the bomber formations performed exactly as planned. At medium distances, the combat box formations proved effective. Overlapping fields of machine gun fire drove off German fighters, and American morale soared. Let the listener feel this early success. Crews cheering after landing, commanders proudly reporting low casualty rates, and newsreels praising the unstoppable flying fortress. But then guide the story into darker territory as the Americans launched deeper raids into the heart of Germany. Missions to targets like Bremen, Hamburg, Schweinfurt, and Regensburg. Described in vivid detail how the German Luftwaffe adapted, organizing disciplined waves of fighters that attacked head-on, tearing through bomber formations with devastating effect. Show the growing fear among bomber crews as they cross the coast of Europe and watch the sky filled with black flak bursts thick enough to walk on. Let the listener hear the metallic pinging of shrapnel hitting fuselages and feel the tension in the cockpit as pilots struggle to keep formation. Create scenes of pure chaos. B-17s losing engines, wings being shredded, bombers spiraling downward while crews bail out, and radio channels filled with desperate voices. Highlight the infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, where losses were so severe that many formations returned home with only a handful of surviving aircraft. Explain how entire groups were nearly wiped out during these deep strikes. Paint the emotional aftermath. Empty bunks at the airfields, commanders struggling to justify continued daylight missions, and American morale shaken to its core. Contrast the promise of daylight accuracy with the brutal cost in human lives. Explain how American leaders debated whether to halt deep penetration missions until long-range fighter escorts were developed. Yet for months they pressed on, believing daylight bombing was essential to crippling Germany's industrial power. And the prompt with a haunting question that sets up the rest of the story. As American losses reached unsustainable levels, could the daylight strategy survive without a miracle? Leave the listener hanging on the edge of uncertainty, unsure whether the American gamble would destroy Germany or destroy the bomber crews first. Craft a dark, atmospheric narration that explores the world of RAF Bomber Command and its evolution into a force that ruled the night skies over Germany. Begin by placing the listener inside a British airbase on a cold evening in 1942. The sun is setting, crews receive their briefing, and tension fills the room as the target, often a heavily defended German city, is revealed. Describe the emotional weight, young pilots quietly writing final letters, engineers loading bombs, and navigators studying routes illuminated only by dim lamps. Transition to the moment the massive Lancaster and Halifax begin taxiing to the runway. Engines roar, propellers blur, and one by one, the heavy bombers rise into a star-speckled sky. Describe the eerie silence once they leave the airfield behind, just the hum of engines and the blackened countryside below. Unlike the Americans, the British fly with minimal formation, each bomber isolated in darkness, guided only by radio silence and dead reckoning navigation. Explain the unique technologies Britain developed to survive and operate at night. The GE navigation system, oboe precision guidance, and the groundbreaking H2S radar system that painted crude images of cities and rivers below. Describe how Pathfinder units dropped colored flares to mark targets for the main bomber stream, creating a haunting, almost supernatural glow above German cities. But contrast this innovation with the extreme dangers. Describe German searchlights suddenly snapping on, sweeping the sky like fingers of white fire. When they converge on a bomber, flak batteries open up, turning the air into a storm of metal. Add suspenseful scenes of German night fighters, Bf-110s and Ju-88s, silently stalking bombers using airborne radar, getting close enough for gunners to see the flash of enemy cannons. Show the emotional turmoil inside the bombers, gunners scanning the darkness, pilots straining to hold altitude, and everyone praying that the faint shadow behind them is not a night fighter closing in. The terror is different from daylight warfare. It is quieter, more psychological, and filled with unknowns. Explain the British philosophy behind it all. After losing too many crews in daylight raids early in the war, the night had become their only shield. Night warfare meant less accuracy, yes, but far greater survivability. For Britain, preserving crews was essential, and strategic bombing still had to continue. The night became their ally, their identity, and their battlefield. And the prompt by contrasting the British and American approaches. The British owned the night, using shadows and radar to survive. The Americans owned the day, relying on firepower and precision. Yet neither could defeat Germany alone. Hint that the war would eventually demand cooperation between these two radically different strategies.
Write a deeply analytical yet dramatic narration exploring why Britain and America clung so fiercely to their opposite bombing doctrines. Begin by showing the mindset within RAF Bomber Command. After their horrific losses in 1940, RAF leaders believed daylight bombing was nothing short of suicide. The enemy's defenses were simply too strong. The shift to nighttime raids had saved thousands of airmen, and any suggestion of returning to daylight bombing felt like repeating past mistakes. In British eyes, nighttime was not a choice, it was survival. Then move the narrative to American High Command. In the United States, air doctrine had been shaped long before America entered the war. The Air Corps Tactical School taught that precision bombing in daylight could cripple a nation's war machine. And this doctrine was tied to national identity. American belief in technology, engineering, and industrial power. The B-17 Flying Fortress, with its armor and many machine guns, was designed specifically for this doctrine. More importantly, the Americans believed in the Norden bombsight with almost religious devotion. They guarded it, swore upon its accuracy, and claimed it could drop bombs with surgical precision. To them, night bombing seemed almost primitive. Next, describe the conflict between the two allies. In early 1942 and 1943, British and American generals held tense meetings. Include exchanges such as "daylight bombing is murder" from the British side and "night bombing is guesswork" from the Americans. These disagreements were not just strategic, they were emotional and personal. Each nation believed the other was making a terrible mistake. Explain how pride played a massive role. Neither side wanted to admit they might be wrong. British leaders felt their experience gave them authority. Americans felt their technology and doctrine were superior. Each side saw the other as blind to reality. Yet both sides also had valid points. Britain had experience and survivability on their side. America had accuracy and firepower. Describe how this tension slowly gave way to cooperation. Britain continuing night raids, America continuing daylight precision strikes, creating a 24-hour bombing cycle that overwhelmed German defenses. End this prompt by emphasizing that ego, doctrine, and technology all shaped the war, but ultimately, cooperation shaped victory.
Craft a gripping and triumphant narration that explains how the daylight bombing strategy nearly collapsed until the arrival of long-range escort fighters changed everything. Begin by describing the disastrous American missions of 1943, especially the Schweinfurt and Regensburg raids, where bomber formations suffered catastrophic losses. Depict the emptiness of American airfields afterward, rows of damaged aircraft, missing crews, and commanders wondering whether daylight bombing was still possible. Then introduce the game-changing moment, the arrival of the P-51 Mustang. Describe the aircraft in cinematic detail, its sleek design, its Packard-built Merlin engine, and its incredible range that finally allowed it to escort bombers deep into Germany, even as far as Berlin. Show how bomber crews reacted when they first saw Mustangs overhead. Hope returning to faces that had long expected death. Create action-packed aerial scenes. Mustangs diving out of the sun to attack German fighters. Dogfights swirling around bomber formations. American escort fighters sweeping ahead of the bombers, clearing the skies, and giving the flying fortresses the protection they had always needed. Describe how German pilots, once confident in attacking unescorted bombers, now faced relentless Mustang pursuit. This changed everything. Daylight precision strikes suddenly became sustainable. American bombers could hit vital targets with accuracy. Oil refineries, synthetic fuel plants, ball bearing factories, aircraft production centers, and transportation hubs. Meanwhile, RAF Bomber Command continued its massive nighttime area bombing campaigns, creating a devastating 24-hour cycle that Germany could no longer resist. The Americans flew by day because they believed accuracy could cripple Germany. The British bombed by night because their experience had taught them daylight meant destruction. In the end, both strategies proved essential, and together they shattered the German war machine. In the cold European dawn of 1943, mist rolling over Allied airfields, rows of B-17s and Lancasters standing silently as crews prepare for missions that could decide their fate. The world caught between darkness and daylight, a perfect metaphor for two nations using opposite methods to fight the same enemy. In 1940, Britain, standing alone after the fall of France, desperately needed to strike Germany. RAF Bomber Command sent its light and medium bombers into the skies in broad daylight, fueled by hope and courage, but lacking protection. Formations lifted into the clear morning only to be ambushed by waves of Bf-109s and Bf-110s waiting for them. Paint the sky with images of burning aircraft, pilots struggling to keep shattered machines airborne, entire squadrons disappearing into plumes of smoke. Emphasize the shock and heartbreak when missions returned with half of their crews missing. These losses carved a permanent scar into the British mindset. Daylight meant death. Slowly, Britain embraced the darkness. First, night raids were clumsy. Bombers got lost, targets were missed, and accuracy was terrible. But for the British, survival mattered more than precision. Bomber Command slowly transformed the night into its own battlefield. The eerie glow of Pathfinders dropping flares, the hum of H-2S radar screens, and the tension inside Lancaster crews flying alone through starless skies. German searchlights swept upward like blades, cutting through the blackness, trapping bombers in white tunnels of light. When a bomber was coned, flak and night fighters closed in like predators. This battle was quieter, colder, and more psychological than daylight warfare, filled with long moments of darkness punctured by sudden terror. In the United States, before it joined the war, American air doctrine was built on faith in technology and machine power. The Air Corps Tactical School taught that heavily armed bombers, especially the B-17 Flying Fortress, could defend themselves through overlapping fire. Scenes of American test flights in the 1930s, B-17 formations flying in perfect geometric patterns, gunners practicing synchronized fire. Officers proudly declaring, "A tight formation is a flying fortress." highlight the almost religious belief in the Norden bombsight, which Americans claimed could deliver pinpoint accuracy. For the U.S., daylight bombing wasn't just strategy, it was identity. Accuracy required sunlight. Night bombing felt sloppy and dishonorable. When the Americans arrived in Britain in 1942, the clash of cultures between RAF and USAAF leadership was intense. Bring the meeting rooms to life. British commanders warning with stern faces, daylight bombing will annihilate your crews. While American generals insist, night bombing wastes bombs and spares the enemy. This was more than disagreement. It was a collision of world views. Each side believed deeply that the other was wrong. Then carry the story into the brutal skies over Europe. Early American raids that succeeded over France gave crews confidence, but as they pushed deeper into Germany, the Luftwaffe unleashed new levels of organized rage. Entire groups flying into swarms of fighters attacking head-on, cannon shells tearing through cockpits, fire erupting from engines. The sky becomes a slaughterhouse. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg missions leave formations shredded, bombers limping home with missing engines, broken windows, and half their gunners dead or wounded. Airfields fall silent as casualty lists grow. Some crews refuse to believe they will live another month. The belief that bombers don't need escorts collapses under the weight of reality. Meanwhile, the British nighttime enemy evolved. German night fighters equipped with Liechtenstein radar, Schrage Musik cannons mounted upward, and silent engines crept beneath bombers and fired deadly bursts into fuel tanks and bomb bays. If daylight raids were violent and chaotic, nighttime raids were predatory and psychological. Fear, exhaustion, and darkness were constant companions. Bring the story to its turning point. Introduce the P-51 Mustang in dramatic fashion, the aircraft that changed everything. Describe its arrival at Allied bases like a savior, sleek, fast, long range, able to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Bomber crews watching Mustangs flying overhead for the first time and realizing the nightmare might finally end. Let the narration burst with energy as Mustangs dive into enemy formations, breaking apart Luftwaffe attacks and sweeping the skies clean. With escorts, daylight bombing becomes deadly to Germany instead of to the Americans. By 1944, a new rhythm emerged. Americans crushed factories, refineries, and infrastructure by day with precision. British bombers burned rail yards, cities, and industrial zones by night with overwhelming force. This 24-hour cycle overwhelmed German defenses. The Luftwaffe collapsed, fuel supplies dwindled, transportation networks broke apart, and German industry began to suffocate. The Americans bombed by day because they believed sunlight gave them accuracy, control, and technological superiority. The British bombed by night because the daylight had almost destroyed them, and the darkness had become their shield. Two opposite philosophies, born from two different experiences, forged a single unstoppable strategy. By the end of the war, their combined efforts did what neither could have done alone. In the clash between day and night, doctrine and reality, courage and fear, the skies over Europe became a battlefield where two nations learned that victory often requires not choosing one path, but merging two. Together, the daylight of America and the darkness of Britain shaped the outcome of the most devastating air war in history.